Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Amen. So, these are incredibly powerful verses that we've just read. Some can say very well known, similar to John 3:16. These are verses that we repeat all the time. And it's so interesting that David speaks of them with such certainty. I don't know about you, but as a Christian, I've had moments in my life where I struggle to sometimes speak with the promises of God with such certainty, even after the things that he's done in my life. It can be a very difficult process. Sometimes you can feel a bit like a doubting Thomas. And it's a very difficult thing to do. My favorite preacher, Paul Washer, for those of you that know him, he's a very famous Southern Baptist preacher in America. He says that Psalm 23 acts as a profound test of faith. And I agree with that, and we'll have a look at why. Obviously, we've got 6 verses in the psalm, and we're going to sort of group them in verses 1 to 3, verse 4, and the verses 5 and 6 together, and you'll see why I do that in a second. Verse 1, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. David speaks through these verses with such a trust in who God is. He speaks with certainty. He envisions God as our guiding light who is unfailing when he says, I shall not want. God is there to correct the flock when they wander astray. A quick search of the qualities of a shepherd will bring up things like vigilance, selflessness, and leadership. Here's a quick quiz for you. Have any of you ever seen a movie called Good Will Hunting? Okay, so is that the majority of people or not? So for those of you that haven't, it involves Matt Damon. He plays a troubled boy genius. He's got a genius level IQ, but he struggles with the responsibility of the gift that he has. He gets himself into a spot of bother, and as a result, part of his community service is he has to go to a psychologist played by Robin Williams. So both of them have a sort of genius level IQ, and they have a verbal sparring match, trying to get the better of each other, trying to get the upper hand. And eventually, Robin Williams brings him to a place where he challenges Matt Damon, and he says, tell me, Will, what do you really want to do? Matt Damon isn't used to being challenged. And in his tongue-in-cheek Boston accent, he says, I want to be a shepherd. I want to get some sheep. I want to tend to them. You can judge the Boston accent afterwards. But the reason he wants to become a shepherd is because there is some form of comfort in it. He's saying it as a joke, but actually there's sort of a deeper meaning behind the line. The things Will lacks of vigilance, selflessness, leadership, the responsibility he's not willing to take on in his life at that point, are reflected in a shepherd, which is why he finds comfort in it. Would you agree, as humans, we need things like vigilance, selflessness, and leadership? I'd argue that these things are essential to human survival. Vigilance, for protection and warning when we are in danger, much like a sheepdog. Selflessness, to give up the wants or desires of oneself to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Leadership, to take responsibility for decisions that not only affect us, but affect those around us. Scholars estimate that David wrote Psalm 23 whilst he was on the run from Absalom. Now, if I remember correctly, Mike spoke about this about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and David was on the run from Absalom between 8 and 10 years. So this is quite a long period of time. So when we speak about a shepherd there to comfort us, comfort is very much what David is doing in verses 1 to 3. If we look in the previous psalm, Psalm 22:16, David is obviously talking about the prophecy of Jesus, and he states, For the dogs have surrounded me. The congregation of the wicked has enclosed me. They have pierced my hands and feet. David is going from the suffering of Jesus Christ and the Messiah as part of the will of God in Psalm 22 to the comfort he can bring in Psalm 23. So I've got 2 rules of 3 for you today. I know most preachers only have 3 points in the sermon, so 6 might be a lot to take, but they sort of bleed into each other, so I hope we can follow. So the first is being the past, the present, and the future. So in verses 1 to 3, we are very much dealing with the past. David is going through what he knows God to be in order to encourage himself of God's truth for the time ahead. In one way, this verses 1 to 3 serve as a way to encourage him, but it's a psalm of experience. David is, encouragement cannot come without the experience of some form of hope. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is, for example, I'm going to ask Josh this question. If I said to Josh, do you fancy running a marathon with me after church? We have our answer. So sometimes the ability when there is no past experience of having done it, or the inconceivable notion that something can be achieved, can remove the idea of hope from it. And the likelihood is Josh could probably run a marathon, but the past experience of hope would fuel him to drive him on as he would do that task. So, verse 2, he says, he makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still water. The term he makes implies some form of correction or discipline. The idea that we may be on our own path, which is walking against God's will. So, lots of you may think he makes, that sounds like some sort of slave driver or some sort of dictator. But I would encourage you to view it in the way a father corrects his child. Following on, it says, he makes me lie down in green pastures. The picture of green pastures shows God's understanding for our rest, comfort, and the right timing in our lives. God can remove big decisions from our hands when we are going against his will. This could be jobs, relationship, financial decisions, any of the above, whatever's going on in your life, where we may think our own wisdom can supersede God's. We then see a contrast following that, saying, he leads me beside the still waters. This encapsulates the image of the lion and the lamb. The lion, he makes or corrects. The lamb, he leads. So this brings me to my second rule of 3. Christ works in our life in 3 different ways. He makes and corrects us. He leads and then guides us. He comforts and restores us. And in verse 3, it says, he restores my soul. So this is how this pattern can be imagined. God corrects us away from our own agendas into his will. He leads us along that will because we require nurturing and understanding of how to listen and interpret it. He comforts us through the process, restoring our soul from the wounds of the past when he had to make or correct us. This is what David means when he states, I shall not want. Why does God do this? Answer comes in verse 3. We shall not want for his name's sake. Moving forward into verse 4, we've dealt with the past. Now we're dealing with the present. David has been repeating the verses of what he knows God to be in order for the current moment. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. This is a sort of visor down moment. For those of you that don't know what that means, have you ever seen Lord of the Rings, Kingdom of Heaven, Not seeing very many nods here. Well, picture a movie where there's a sort of insurmountable odds. The protagonists or the good guys are severely outnumbered and the hordes are amassing, and what task seems to be ahead of them seems unfathomable. It seems completely unachievable. It seems certain death. And there's a overwhelming sense of fear that you'll often get in the scenes preceding this, where it seems to grip everyone in the camp or in the walls of the city. But eventually, what happens to those band of merry men is the fear begins to dissipate as they begin to find resolve. And eventually, defending the women and children in the city, or the honor of the city, or Christ, like in Kingdom of Heaven, becomes paramount to their own lives. So I call it a visor down moment because at this point you'll see them kiss the sword or visor down or run charging into spears or something dramatic as such. So verse 4 is like this, but with a little bit of a different twist. It's a visor down moment, but as the encouragement of God's truth, he's just spent 3 verses repeating, they form themselves into belief, which has formed themselves into resolve. Almost, if you view verses 1 to 3 as a sort of liturgy, repeating again and again and again. David's certainty of the situation that he is presently in is contrasted by the certainty that he has got nothing to fear. I will fear no evil. He's in the valley of the shadow of death. A valley is a big, deep thing, literally walled by death. You could picture it. And he says he is certain of God's power to exalt his name, and that evil is powerless against that. For you are with me. Again, David is not repeating prophecies that he's not yet come to see. He's stating his experience of who he knows God to be. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Going back to what I was saying about the qualities of shepherd, vigilance and selflessness leads to leadership and comfort. He makes is your rod. Think of that almost like a sheepdog. Your staff, think of literally a shepherd's staff leading the way. And comfort, think of a loving father. These are the ways in which God works in our lives. So we've established that David is repeating the experience of Christ in the past to deal with the present, and now he goes on to the future in verse 5. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. The victory has already been won, for the table represents a victory banquet after battle. I was actually having a chat with Sally at the 9 a.m. and she said, how significant is it that whilst we're in the presence of our enemies, the victory table is already setting before them? That is the power and majesty of God. Because we have a certainty of who God really is in the past and the present, we have a certainty of who God really is in the future. As Christians, during difficult times is when we need to repeat these promises the most. Kezia, my wife, will tell you, I call it doubling down. So many of you will know that I'm a very, very passionate Arsenal supporter, and we did very well this season. We're on the Premier League. We unfortunately lost the Champions League final, but lots of you will have seen me in my Arsenal shirt at church the next day. I was doubling down. So the reason why I do that, I have a rule. Whether it's the Springboks, whether it's Arsenal, whichever team I support, if we lose, I always wear my top the next day so that people know when we win, I was there in the dark times. I was there when we were losing 5-0 to Chelsea. So my question is, with the doubling down, if you go back to verse 4 and what I was saying about resolve, I know where Arsenal's been, and I know in the present what they are, and I know what they'll be in the future. And do we have our Arsenal tops on for Christ? Do we have our Jesus tops on when it's defeat. When we've lost 3-0, it's not easy. When we're playing in the third place playoff, do we double down? Don't know if any of you know the American Navy SEAL, David Goggins. Anybody ever heard of him? I'm a very, very big fan of David Goggins. I've done a number of his challenges. But for those of you that don't know, he became a Navy SEAL. He runs all sorts of ultra marathons. He's in his mid-50s. He's got no cartilage in his knee. He runs 240 miles. But he started out weighing over 300 pounds and wanting to become a Navy SEAL. Now, that's like the elite special forces. Think of the SAS or the SBS. And he couldn't find a single recruiter that would take him. And he found one that said, look, if you lose, so he's 300 pounds, and he had to get down to 180 pounds. So yeah, it was about 120 pounds he had to lose. And he said, if you can lose that body weight in 3 months, I'll put you through this process. So he then spent 8 hours every single day for the next 3 months, and he lost the weight, and he got in. So that was an incredibly difficult process. The reason I'm saying that is because he then goes on to do 3 hell weeks in 1 year. For those of you that don't know what that is, it is a 136-hour week where you have no sleep, you are in your military gear, you are in surf torture, you carry logs, you carry boats above your head. It's endless. And he tells the story when he was in Hell Week about you're in these boat crews. So it's about roughly 8 guys in a boat crew. And he looked on the faces, I think it was on the Wednesday, it starts on the Monday. He looked on the faces of all of his boat crew, and all he saw was defeat. He knew they were all ready to ring the bell and tap out. And because he had been through such a grueling task beforehand, he understood that he had to go back and count the hope in what he had been through before, the resolve. So what he starts doing is he starts shouting, who's going to carry the boat? And he starts shouting louder and louder. And then his crew starts getting a little bit jacked up. Boat crew 2 is going to carry the boat. Then they're screaming it, and then they're throwing the boat above their head. So the look of defeat then transfers off of the face of the men in his boat crew to the instructors. To the instructors who had been walking around judging him, saying, I was better than you, I was better than you, with their jackets and their coffee now. To, we never threw the boat up. We couldn't do that. I was struggling at this stage. And it's the idea of doubling down into the resolve, into the little ounce of hope that you have. And that is God. God is always the ounce of hope that we have in every situation in our life. Verse 6 says, surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. God's promises are assured to David. He knows God makes, leads, and comforts, and will continue to do so for as long as he lives, for his name's sake. But there's an even greater promise that David follows this up with. And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. The victory goes beyond our life on earth, but to the promise and sacrifice of Christ that we can dwell with him in eternity. All of our experiences in life are for his name's sake. Much like David, who faced trials against Saul, Absalom, he had successes against the Philistines and the Moabites. All of these experiences served a purpose, and the purpose was to glorify God. That's why we've got them written down. They encourage, they give us hope, and that hope should turn into resolve. Micah, for those of you who don't know, sitting at the back, did a very grueling task this week. He ran 66 kilometers, and I ran the first leg with him. And we had moments of small little bits of hope that we had to cling on to that turned into resolve. And I think Michael will tell you there were moments you had to dig deep, but the resolve produced something amazing in the end, did it not? Amen. We need to listen to God, whether He is correcting us, leading us, or comforting us. We need to ask ourselves, how can we use the present situation, regardless of how we feel, for His name's sake? Moving forward, I would encourage you, not just this week, but to look in areas of your life where God is trying to make, lead, or comfort you. Then double down on the promises and blessings you've been given from the Lord and apply them going forward. Amen.